Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Kristin Scott Thomas and Sharon Horgan lead a choir of military wives. When their husbands are deployed to Afghanistan, their wives living on the military base need to find something to divert their attention away from their worries over their loved ones. They eventually decide to form a choir with Kristin Scott Thomas's uptight Kate and Sharon Horgan's shopkeeper Lisa bickering over their different methods of leading the choir. The choir do slowly start to find their harmony and are invited to sing at the Festival of Remembrance at the Royal Albert Hall, but will the choir, especially Kate and Lisa, get their act together in time? Military Wives is very loosely based on a true story. In 2011, Gareth Malone, as part of his BBC Two series The Choir, took a group of military wives and trained them ready for performance on Remembrance Sunday at the Royal Albert Hall. That last part is pretty much all this film has in common with reality. In fact, it doesn't even have a Gareth Malone substitute in it, it's just an event that happens to the characters. Nevertheless, that was so successful that there have been numerous military wives choirs formed up and down the country in response to it. The film is directed by Peter Cattaneo, who is best known for directing The Full Monty, which is pretty appropriate because this film is following in the footsteps of the formula that he created 23 years ago. It's worth talking about The Full Monty because it was a hugely influential film, especially for something that came completely out of nowhere. No one working on it expected it to be quite the hit that it was, especially as it was a combination of kitchen sink social realism that the British do so well, but also this kind of Hollywood hopeful underdog story. It was both gritty and optimistic, and I think that's why that connected with audiences all over the world. Certainly no one working on The Full Monty anticipated it would get nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars in 1998. Obviously that was the year when Titanic trounced everything in its path, but still, that was the little movie that could, and in doing so, it created a pattern that has been emulated numerous times since, and it's understandable why, because it works very well in the UK, but can also be readily exported as well. So I'm thinking of things like Calendar Girls and Made in Dagenham, to name but two. But as the years have gone by, that formula has become abundantly apparent. As I sat there watching Military Wives, I was really struck by how similar it was to Fisherman's Friends, which was released at exactly this time last year. And like this movie, that took the bare nugget of a true event and ran it through this cookie cutter of generic crowd pleaser. Fisherman's Friends and Military Wives take what are potentially interesting stories and blandifies them into just broadly appealing but forgettable fare. So why exactly does something like The Full Monty work when Military Wives doesn't? I would argue that comes down to the characters. The characters in The Full Monty are far better realised. They're much better observed and better played by each of its leads. It's the characters that audiences connected with in The Full Monty, not necessarily the story itself, which is relatively thin, and much of the charm and humour comes out of the different performances and how they react to each of the situations that they find themselves in. That's the secret to a good feel-good movie. It's not the plot, it's not the narrative, it's the characters within it. You get that right, you're onto a winner. And in Military Wives' case, you've got a group of characters that are people we can relate with, but never builds upon them to anything beyond that. And that's a crucial failing that's even further amplified by the fact that it's already based on a true story that much of the target audience is already familiar with. We know how this plays out in reality. So the story is not something that should be driving our interest. It should be that cast of characters. And yet, I never found myself invested in the action of Military Wives. It never really held my interest, and I think that's largely because of the writing. I think that the characters are just simply sketched out for the most part, and that's a real shame considering the talent involved with this movie. You have Sharon Horgan and Kristin Scott Thomas, both very talented actors in their own rights, but together they don't really play off of each other. The movie is banking on that chalk and cheese kind of conflict between the two characters and their very different approaches to conducting the choir. Kate is very controlling. She's very much sees herself as the leader of the group because she's married to the colonel, whereas Lisa goes for a more relaxed approach. And you can see this in their different approaches to conducting the choir. Kate goes for this very strict adherence to reading the notes off the sheets, whereas Lisa argues for a much looser approach, arguing they'll be much less stilted that way, but also play much more towards the strengths of their choir, which is very inexperienced. And ultimately, the film sides with her. The film argues that it isn't about chasing perfection, because life isn't. It's about dealing with those imperfections and hurdles and taking them in your stride. Unfortunately, I don't think this pairing works. I think that Horgan and Scott Thomas, they don't have the chemistry that you would want out of an opposites pairing like this. It needs some kind of spark that is never generated by the two of them. It feels like their approaches to the material are too vastly different, unfortunately. Individually, they do have moments that work. Horgan, who is so funny on TV, gets some of the more amusing moments in the film, and I think that Scott Thomas does well with the more dramatic material that she's handed Kate. Although she's trying to be strong and puts on this really good facade, she's also dealing with the fact that she lost her son during the last deployment, and she's still grieving over that. She spends a lot of her time sat at home with a glass of wine, watching the Home Shopping Channel, and ordering things in this kind of collectomania in her grief. That's both amusing and poignant as a detail at the same time. I just don't think they play off each other in the way it really should do, and because of that, much of the comedy in the film is missing, and this problem manifests itself on a much larger scale with the other military wives who are barely even characters. Most of them are glorified extras, and I'm not expecting the film to make an entire choir a bunch of fully developed characters. That's far too much to ask for, but I would have anticipated it would have spent a bit more time actually making them distinctive. Of the choir, only 3 of them stood out to me, and even then, 2 of them was still so two-dimensional. I can very briefly describe them as the Welsh one that can sing and the one that can't. The only military wife that genuinely stood out as a fully realised character is Amy James Kelly as Sarah, this new military wife. Her husband has been deployed for the very first time and she's anxious and scared, and that's because that character gets a lot of screen time, a lot of attention, and also gets a lot of dramatic material. I think that James Kelly does a really good job of making that character very plausible and believable, but she is the exception in this film, unfortunately. And when it comes to secondary characters in films like this, they're crucial. They're the ones that can really stand out in opportune moments. If you don't develop those characters, who are the audience meant to laugh with? Who are they meant to cry with? It's the exact same problem that Fisherman's Friends found itself in, where most of the titular Fisherman's Friends were actually just background players. They were very secondary in their own movie. And the same thing happens in Military Wives. They just end up being a band instead of being distinctive personalities in their own right. Luckily though, Jason Flemyng is there. He actually brings a lot of charm to his role. You can definitely tell that he has a lot of affection for the choir, especially as their abilities improve. I think that he's actually very likeable. It was a fairly small role, but nevertheless does add some of the charm that most of the film is lacking, at least for me. It's a shame that the comedic elements are such a non-starter because the more serious side of it does periodically work. I think that for all of its faults, the movie does have its heart very firmly rooted in the right place. It wants to be this sincere, heartfelt tribute to servicemen and their families, and it takes a perspective very rarely seen on film, and that is the people left behind, the people left anxious, but also alone and isolated, worried about their loved ones and what news each passing day might bring, and dreading the ring of the doorbell that will tell them that their loved ones are not coming back, and finding their way through that through solidarity and coming together as a group to support each other and finding that escapism. That is the appeal of the movie, and occasionally the film manages to strike that. The movie does sidestep the more political elements of its premise. Very briefly, there's a scene where they encounter a protester, and Lisa says very quickly, "We don't have an opinion on the war, we're married to it." And that very much says what it needs to, in that it's not really the place to talk about those things. It's about supporting the men now they are there, which is a very subtle distinction, but an important one nevertheless. And inevitably, when tragedy does hit the group, that I think is some of the film's best moments, dealing with the day-to-day domesticity that comes also with warfare at the same time. And certainly I think that there are some quite moving scenes, even though I wasn't hugely invested in most of the film. Definitely I think the funeral sequence in particular really did have a lump in my throat. You'd have a very hard heart not to relate that to very real circumstances. I think that for many viewers, that'll be very painfully recognisable. And I do think the movie works in those moments, but perhaps also to the detriment of its comedy. I think that the tone in general is quite sombre. It plays more towards these moments than it does the more feel-good humour of it all. I think a lot of the problems with this film comes down to the fact that Cattaneo directs this movie in an incredibly flat way. Cattaneo has not directed a feature film in over a decade, since 2008's The Rocker, and it's very clear that he's directing this with a quite televisual eye. The cinematography is exceptionally unexciting. There's a very point-and-shoot approach to the material, and because Cattaneo doesn't seem to be really putting any kind of personality into the movie, that makes the very formulaic approach of the script all that more apparent. The script goes through every single convention that you would associate with this movie, right down to the fact that there is this second act breakup, there is this big argument between Lisa and Kate that inevitably ends up with both characters saying incredibly horrible things that feel really forced. Like a lot of their relationship, it just feels like it's forcing the conflict just because that's what this kind of movie demands, rather than it making sense for the characters. If Cattaneo's direction actually had some sparks of life to it, it would greatly improve this movie. What would also improve this movie is a much tighter edit as well. Military Wives runs 2 hours long, and there is no excuse for it to be that length. Scenes run on for twice as long as they really should do, because they're filled with empty spaces and dead air that should have been eliminated in post-production. But like the direction, there's a lethargy here that creeps into the editing. This is a movie that should have a real snap to its pacing, but instead it feels awkward and unfocused, and amplifies the fact there isn't that much story here at the end of the day. A choir going to the Royal Albert Hall to perform is not enough for a movie of this length, not unless you bulk it up with something else, and that's not the case here. Again, I point towards the Full Monty, which got this right. It recognised it didn't have that much of a narrative, and therefore made sure it was 90 minutes. That is the perfect ideal length for this kind of movie. Military Wives would have benefited from that kind of discipline. Cattaneo's direction also falters during the choir numbers. This is ostensibly a musical, but aside from the final number for obvious reasons, none of the actual singing portions of the film are especially memorably staged. Often they blur together. There's no attempt to make them distinctive or memorable in their own right, and considering that's meant to be a big appeal of the movie, that feels like another missed opportunity to give this some kind of character to it, and at least let the audience try and sing along with the characters. But the movie's direction never seems to invite us to do that. I'm very much aware that I'm not a target audience for Military Wives, which aims biased towards older audiences and women, and certainly think there will be audiences that find a charm in this that I didn't, that appreciate that it's easygoing and has a feel-good spirit. It's a movie about pulling together through turbulent, uncertain times, and in many ways couldn't be more appropriate for our current moment. I just wish it was a better film. Military Wives aims to be nothing more than nice and pleasant, and it certainly achieves those aims, but I also found it to be frighteningly dull. This is a movie that aims to be nothing more than rigidly conventional at every single turn. It doggedly refuses to be in any way surprising. It is exactly what you expect it to be, and nothing more than that. It doesn't even aim to be memorable. It just aims to be another one of these feel-good movies that are now being churned out on a yearly basis, apparently. It takes an interesting story and turns it into fodder, essentially. And it does so being very one-note at the same time. Military Wives is the most formulaic British crowd pleaser in every single way possible, as the full Monty director Peter Cattaneo pretty much repeats what he did over 20 years ago that set the mould in the first place. The film aims to be nothing more than pleasantly mild, with plot beats that you can pretty much set your watch to, but the flat direction means there is not enough humour and charm to distract from its predictability, not helped by a very overlong 2-hour running time. That said, it is sincere in its convictions and wants to be a tribute to service people and their families, and the film is far more successful in its more serious moments that put the anxieties and sacrifice of warfare to the forefront. While very loosely inspired by true events, I feel there simply isn't enough story or incident to carry a whole film, but there is likely an audience who will find it pleasingly diverting, even if they have seen this kind of film many times before. If you like this review, then sing your heart out over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out. Stay safe, everyone.